She woke to the scent of roses and the feel of silk brushing against her skin. For a moment, her mind hovered in that foggy space between dreams and reality. But as her eyes slowly fluttered open, the haze lifted, and panic rushed in. The ceiling above her was impossibly high, decorated with golden trim and a painted mural of angels. Velvet drapes in a deep wine red hung from the tall windows, swaying gently with the morning breeze. Everything gleamed with quiet opulence: carved furniture, crystal lamps, a gilded mirror across the room. It was beautiful, but foreign. This wasn't her bedroom. This wasn't her life. She sat up, heart hammering, her breath catching in her throat. Her body felt different, lighter, more delicate. Her fingers trembled as she reached up to touch her face. Her skin was soft, her hair long and silky, cascading down her shoulders in waves she never remembered styling. A single word echoed in her mind, cold and out of place: Duchess. It made no sense. But when she stood up, her legs moving on instinct more than memory, the truth began to dawn. The nightgown she wore was made of the finest satin. The slippers by the bed weren't hers. Even her reflection in the mirror seemed like a stranger, graceful, refined, with eyes that held questions she didn't yet know how to ask. Then came the knock. Sharp, polite, final. The door opened before she could answer. A young maid entered, her expression carefully blank. She curtsied, but it wasn't respectful, it was rehearsed. "Good morning, Duchess," she said, her tone clipped. "Breakfast will be served in the east parlor." Before she could respond, before she could ask who she was or why the maid looked at her like an unwanted guest, the girl turned and left, the door clicking shut behind her. "Duchess?" She whispered the word aloud, but it felt foreign on her tongue. She was no duchess. She had been. That's when the realization struck. She couldn't remember her name, not the one that felt like it should belong to her. Her heart raced. Her throat tightened. Somewhere in this grand house, someone knew who she was supposed to be. Someone had brought her here. But why? And more importantly, where was the real Duchess? She walked to the window, pulling back the curtain. Outside stretched an estate so massive it made her stomach twist. Fountains, hedges trimmed like art, and carriages lining a stone path. The world was beautiful, perfect, but she didn't belong to it. Not yet. Behind all this elegance, she felt something strange creeping in. A sense of danger, like she had stepped into the role of someone both powerful and hated. She had no idea who she was anymore. But one thing was clear: she had awakened in someone else's life, and if she wanted to survive, she'd need to learn how to play the part. She thought a duchess would be respected, admired, even feared. But by midday, she understood just how wrong she was. The halls of the grand estate were eerily quiet, yet eyes followed her everywhere. Cold, judgmental, mocking. Every servant she passed bowed, but none with sincerity. Behind her back, she heard whispers, suppressed laughter, a maid giggling behind a gloved hand, a footman deliberately looking away as she entered a room. She tried to speak with one of them, a kind-looking older maid dusting a vase in the hallway. "Excuse me, could you tell me where the east parlor is?" she asked gently. The woman looked at her, eyes narrowing just slightly, then turned without a word and walked away. It was subtle, but it stung. She eventually found the east parlor on her own, guided more by luck than design. Breakfast had long gone cold. The table was still set, but no one waited for her. No butler, no maid, just a single plate of food, untouched, and a silver teapot that had long since cooled. She sat down, trying to hold her composure, and poured herself a cup. The silence in the room was deafening. She wasn't a guest in this home. She was the Duchess. But no one seemed to care. Worse, no one even seemed to like her. As the hours passed, it became painfully clear. She held a title, but no power. The staff obeyed her in the most superficial ways, offering only the bare minimum required by duty. And the longer she remained in this grand, lonely house, the more she realized she wasn't feared. She was ignored. When she asked a question, they pretended not to hear. When she requested help, they responded with short, clipped answers or blank stares. Once, She found two maids gossiping in the hallway, until they noticed her and fell awkwardly silent, casting glances filled with disdain. It was like she was a ghost wandering the halls of her own mansion, or worse, a usurper. By evening, she was exhausted, not from activity, but from the weight of being unwanted in a life she didn't choose. She returned to her room, closing the heavy door behind her with a sigh. Her fingers brushed over the carved doorknob, lingering there as if searching for some kind of anchor. Who was the original Duchess? What had she done to make everyone loathe her? And more importantly, was she destined to suffer the same fate? She looked around the room once more. The elegance no longer impressed her. The golden accents, the velvet curtains, the marble fireplace, they were nothing more than cold decorations in a gilded cage. She was a duchess, but only by name. In this house, power didn't come from titles. It came from something else. And if she wanted to survive, she would have to find out what. The first time she saw her husband, he didn't look at her. It was late. The sun had already dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows through the grand corridors of the manor. She had gotten lost again. These endless halls all looked the same, and turned a corner only to freeze in place. He stood at the far end of the hall, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a crisp black coat that fit his frame perfectly. His posture was commanding, every movement calculated, the kind of presence that made people lower their gaze without being asked. This was the Duke. Her husband. Her breath caught. For a moment, she didn't know whether to speak, bow, or simply run. But before she could decide, he turned to one of the butlers beside him and said something in a low voice. His tone was sharp, cold. Then he walked past her, without a word, without even meeting her eyes, like she wasn't even there. She stood frozen as his footsteps faded behind her chest tightening. So this was the man everyone feared, the man whose name carried weight beyond the estate, the man whose ring now rested on her finger. She didn't know what she expected. A curious glance? A polite nod? A flicker of interest, maybe even recognition. She got nothing. Later that evening, she dared to ask the housekeeper if the Duke would be joining her for dinner. The woman's answer was curt. The Duke dines alone. No explanation, no apology. That night, she sat at a long dining table, set for two, but only one seat was filled. Hers. The silence stretched unbearably as the candles flickered in the still air. She could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall, the clink of her fork, the ache in her chest. Who was this man she had married? And more importantly, what was the nature of their marriage? From what little she'd seen, there was no affection, no warmth, not even obligation. It was as though he had accepted her presence in his home, but not in his life. Did the real Duchess live like this too? In the shadows of her husband, unloved and unnoticed? She didn't know the rules of this world, but she was starting to understand its cruelty. Every luxurious surface, every polished corner of the estate, seemed designed to hide something rotten beneath. And at the heart of it stood the Duke. Beautiful, distant, untouchable. A cold stranger who wore the mask of nobility and locked his heart behind a door she didn't yet know how to open. In a house that didn't welcome her, silence became her closest companion. The days passed slowly. Conversations were rare. Smiles, even rarer. She wandered the estate like a forgotten soul, memorizing hallways, tracing the wallpaper with her fingertips, searching for something, anything that felt real. She found it in the smallest of things. It started with a cup of tea. One afternoon, overwhelmed by the cold treatment and the weight of her own questions, she retreated to a small sunlit corner of the library. There, she discovered a porcelain tea set left untouched on a tray. No servant brought it. No one had told her it was waiting, but the scent of jasmine rose from the pot, as though someone had known she would come. She poured herself a cup with trembling hands. It was warm, fragrant, comforting in a way nothing else had been since she woke in this strange life. For the first time, she let herself breathe. She sat there, alone, and sipped slowly, eyes closed, letting the steam brush her cheeks. The world outside still felt unreal, like a dream wrapped in velvet and gold. But the tea was real, the warmth was real. And so, a ritual began. Every day, at the same time, She returned to that same spot with a fresh pot of tea she'd prepared herself. No servants, no interruptions, just her in the quiet, and a cup that reminded her of who she used to be. Whoever that was. She tried different blends rose, oolong, mint, and began keeping a small notebook, writing down her thoughts, the flavors, even fragments of memories that sometimes floated to the surface. No one asked where she went, no one followed her. It was her only sanctuary in a house that barely acknowledged her. She wondered if the real Duchess ever sat here. Did she cry here, too? Did she also feel like a stranger in her own life? But there was something else hidden in the ritual, something fragile and unspoken. Hope, a small spark inside her, whispering that maybe she could carve out something of her own. A corner of peace in a place that offered none. A piece of her identity she could hold on to, even if everything else had been stripped away. She may have been a duchess without power, a wife without a husband, a woman without a name. But this moment, this warmth, this silence, it belonged to her. And that was enough. For now, it was meant to be just another quiet afternoon. She had brewed a delicate white tea this time, with hints of pear and chrysanthemum. The library, as always, was empty. The same chair, the same corner, the same soft light streaming in through the tall windows. It was the one part of the day that felt like hers. She poured the tea slowly, the aroma rising in gentle waves. She had just taken her first sip when she heard footsteps. Not hurried, not hesitant, measured, calm. She looked up, startled. And there he was, the Duke. He stood in the doorway, watching her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, they were locked on the teacup in her hands. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. She lowered the cup, unsure of what to say. He had never entered the library before, never looked for her, never shown even a passing interest in her routine. "I didn't know you drank tea," he said quietly, stepping into the room. She blinked. His voice was low and smooth, but not as cold as before. There was something softer beneath it, something she couldn't name. "I do, every day," she replied cautiously. He looked at the steaming pot, then at her notebook resting on the table, its pages half filled with scribbles and tea notes. His eyes lingered there for a moment. Then he spoke again, slower this time. "Will you make that tea for me next time?" It was not a command, not a test, just a simple, surprising request. She nodded, almost without thinking. "Yes, if you'd like." He gave the smallest nod in return. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The room felt heavier when he left, as if something invisible had entered with him, then slipped out behind him. But it wasn't fear. It wasn't dread. It was something else. She stared at the doorway long after he disappeared, heart fluttering against her ribs. She didn't understand what had just happened, but for the first time since arriving in this cold, unfamiliar world, someone had seen her, spoken to her. Not as a ghost, not as a stranger, as a person, and that was enough to keep her up that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what had changed. Because something had. The Duke's unexpected visit should have been a small moment, a passing curiosity, a flicker of warmth in a life otherwise wrapped in frost. But it changed everything. From that day on, the quiet shifted. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but she felt it. The maids no longer laughed behind her back. They fell silent when she entered a room. The butler, who had once ignored her completely, now greeted her with stiff formality. The servants' eyes darted away too quickly, their smiles too forced. It wasn't respect, it was fear. Something had changed, and not just in her. She began to see it in their body language, in the hurried steps that echoed down the marble halls, in the way the house seemed to breathe differently when the Duke's name was mentioned. And it wasn't only the servants. The Duke himself had become a puzzle she couldn't ignore. He didn't return to the library. He didn't ask for tea again. But sometimes she would catch him watching her from across the garden, or passing by the doorway when she walked through the halls. Always distant, always guarded, but no longer indifferent. She didn't know if it was curiosity or something else. One morning, while exploring the West Wing, a part of the manor she hadn't dared to enter before, she overheard voices, two maids whispering just around the corner. "Ah, she doesn't know, does she?" "Of course not. Why would he tell her?" I wouldn't stay in that room if I were her. Not after what happened to the last one. Hush! Someone's coming! By the time she turned the corner, they were gone. Her hands felt cold. Her mind raced. The last one? Were they talking about the previous Duchess? The woman whose life she now occupied? What had happened to her? That evening, she asked the head housekeeper, casually, as if she weren't desperate for answers. Do you know if the Duchess? She corrected herself. The former Duchess, I mean. Did she enjoy this tea blend? The woman hesitated. Just for a second, but it was enough. I wouldn't know, madam. We do not speak of the former mistress. Her voice was tight, her eyes carefully blank. And then she turned and walked away. That night, the estate felt colder, quieter, as if the walls were hiding something old and cruel and buried just beneath the surface. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling once again. But this time, the flutter in her chest wasn't curiosity, it was unease. There were whispers in this house, secrets behind every locked door, and the more she watched the Duke, the more she suspected he was one of them. The days grew heavier, with questions she couldn't ask, and answers no one dared to give. But while the whispers continued behind closed doors, something else was happening, something quieter. It began with glances. Then, presence. The Duke started to appear more often, never announced, never expected. But he was there, passing by the library while she sipped her tea, crossing the corridor just as she left her room, lingering near the garden as she walked among the ivy-covered stone paths. At first, she thought it was coincidence, but coincidences don't hold your gaze for a moment too long. They don't pause outside doorways. They don't leave a rare book on the edge of the table, the very one she'd mentioned she missed reading, though she couldn't remember ever telling him. He didn't speak much. When he did, his tone remained calm, distant, but his actions began to betray something else. One morning, she found fresh jasmine leaves placed neatly beside her teacup. No one claimed responsibility, but she knew. And then came the storm. It rolled in one afternoon, thunder rumbling through the walls, wind howling against the windows. Most of the staff vanished into the depths of the manor. She was walking toward the drawing room when she saw him, standing by the tall window at the end of the hall, staring out at the rain. She hesitated. He didn't move. But then, without turning, he spoke. Are you frightened? His voice was quiet, not cold, not warm, just real. She walked closer, stopping a few feet behind him. No, she said honestly. The storm feels honest. Everything else here hides. He turned his head slightly, just enough for her to see the faintest flicker of surprise in his expression. And then he said something she hadn't expected. You're not like her. Her breath caught. She wanted to ask, like who? But she didn't need to. She knew. He was talking about the former Duchess. She stepped closer. What was she like? His jaw tensed. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, she smiled too much, lied too easily. She made poison taste like honey. He looked at her then, really looked. And in that moment, the mask cracked. There was pain in his eyes. Deep, old, carefully hidden, but raw beneath the surface. She wasn't what people believed, he said. And neither are you. And then, just as quickly, the wall went back up. He turned away, his back straight, his voice cool again. You should return to your room. The storm is worsening. But even as he walked away, she stood frozen in place, heart racing. He had opened a door just for a second, and behind it, there wasn't just coldness. There was grief, there was guilt. There was a man she hadn't met before, and now she couldn't stop wondering, was he a villain, like the servants whispered? Or a prisoner of his own past, just like her? She had always been afraid of knowing too much. But now, the not knowing was worse. After the storm, the house returned to its usual rhythm. Quiet, polished, composed. But she could feel it. A shift. A tremor beneath the stillness. The Duke's words echoed in her mind like footsteps in an empty hall. She wasn't what people believed. And neither are you. What had the former Duchess done to leave such a wound? Why did everyone treat her like a curse, reborn in silk and lace? She needed answers. So she began to search. It started in the library. She combed through old ledgers, dusty account books, even estate journals. She looked for anything that bore the former Duchess's name. But page after page, her presence had been erased, like someone had scrubbed her out of history. And yet, pieces remained. Tiny, overlooked clues. A dried rose between the pages of a forgotten poetry book. A faded initial embroidered inside a cloak tucked away in a storage chest. A letter never sent, creased and yellowing, hidden beneath a drawer lining in the writing desk. She unfolded it with trembling fingers. I am not afraid of the house. I am afraid of the silence, of the way they look at me like I'm already dead. But I know what he's hiding, and if anything happens to me, it will not be an accident. There was no signature, but she didn't need one. Her blood ran cold. What had the Duke been hiding? What had he done? Why had no one spoken her name? Later that evening, she dared to ask a simple question over dinner. The first time they had ever sat at the same table. Do you believe in second chances? She asked, watching him from across the candlelit table. He paused, his fork midway to his lips. His eyes lifted to hers. I believe in consequences, he said. And forgiveness? He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quiet. Forgiveness is earned, not owed. He looked at her for a moment longer, then stood, placing his napkin gently on the table. I'll walk you to your room. She followed in silence. When they reached her door, he didn't leave right away. He looked at her with that same guarded expression, as if he were trying to decide whether or not to say something. But in the end, he didn't speak. He turned and walked away. She closed the door behind her, heart heavy with questions. Was he protecting her from something? Or was he protecting himself? The deeper she dug, the more the house seemed to resist. Locks appeared on doors that were once open. The staff became tighter-lipped, and the Duke, while no longer cold, remained carefully distant, like a man walking a tightrope over secrets he could no longer control. She had stepped into this life by accident, but now she was in too deep to walk away. Something had happened here, something terrible, and the truth was no longer behind her. It was beneath her feet, buried in the very foundations of the estate, waiting to be uncovered. The truth didn't come to her gently. It broke through the silence like a thunderclap. It happened late one night. She couldn't sleep. The storm had passed days ago, but her thoughts had not. The letter still lived in her desk drawer, whispering warnings in the dark. Her search had slowed. Too many locked doors, too many eyes watching her. But that night, one of those doors was open, a small, forgotten study near the back of the West Wing. She had tried it before, always locked. Now it waited for her. Inside, the air was thick with dust and memory. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with ledgers and letters. Old ones, faded ink, fine script. Names she didn't know. Some she did. And then she found it. A journal, bound in soft leather, hidden behind a stack of records. It belonged to the former Duchess. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The entries were scattered, written in a hurried hand. Some had entire pages ripped out, but what remained was enough. He wasn't like this in the beginning. I thought I could fix him. I was wrong. He warned me not to ask about the cellar. I saw him that night. The blood. He said it was an accident, but how can I trust a man who won't even look me in the eyes anymore? She stopped breathing. Each word painted a picture she hadn't dared imagine. The Duke, the former Duchess, a secret locked away in the lower levels of the estate. Something violent, something hidden. She turned the final page. It was smeared, ink blurred, as if written with shaking hands. If anyone finds this, know that I loved him once. But love can't survive fear. I never wanted to become his enemy, but I think I already am. The final entry was dated 2 days before her sudden disappearance. There had been no funeral, no memorial, not even a portrait in the halls. Just silence. She backed away from the desk, the journal clutched to her chest, and then a voice behind her. You weren't meant to see that. She spun around. The Duke stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Not angry, not surprised. Just tired. She didn't speak. Neither did he. He stepped into the room, eyes falling to the journal in her hands. You asked me once if I believed in forgiveness, he said quietly. Now you know why I didn't answer. Her throat was dry. What did you do? There was a long silence. Then, I married a woman I didn't love, to protect someone I did. And when it all began to fall apart, I let her destroy herself. He looked at her then. And for the first time, he looked small. A man stripped of his armor. "She didn't die because of me," he said. "But I didn't save her either." Tears pricked at her eyes, not from fear, from the weight of it all. "So why me?" she whispered. "Why bring me here?" He shook his head. "I didn't choose you. You just arrived. Like a second chance I didn't ask for." They stood in silence, two people bound by a ghost, and for the first time since waking in that golden prison, she understood what kind of life she had stepped into. Not just one of wealth or titles, but of guilt, of grief, of unfinished stories. The truth had been uncovered, but what she did with it, that was now her choice. She could have left, after everything, the whispers, the cruelty, the secrets. She would have been justified. No one would blame her for walking away from the estate, from the title, from him. But she didn't. The morning after the truth came out, she sat in her usual place by the library window. A fresh pot of tea steamed in front of her, untouched. Her fingers rested on the edge of her notebook, but the page remained blank. She was no longer lost. She knew the story now, but she hadn't decided how it would end. She looked up as footsteps approached. The Duke entered the room, his presence quieter than usual. He no longer wore the invisible armor that made him untouchable. There was something raw in his gaze now, something real. "I thought you'd be gone by now," he said. She met his eyes. "I thought about it." He said nothing, but his shoulders stiffened, as if bracing for a blow he felt he deserved. She stood slowly and crossed the room to where he waited. "I came into this life by accident," she said softly. "I didn't choose it. I didn't choose you." His jaw tightened. He began to turn away, but she stopped him with a single word. "But I'm still here." He froze. "I'm still here," she repeated. "Not because I've forgotten what happened. Not because I forgive what can't be undone. But because I see something in you now. Something I didn't see before." He turned to face her fully, his voice low. "And what is that?" She looked up at him, steady and unafraid. "A man who regrets. A man who's been haunted for too long. And maybe, a man who's ready to begin again." Silence stretched between them, charged, uncertain. Then, slowly, his hand reached out. Not to take hers, not to pull her in. Just an offer. A question. And this time, she was the one to answer. She placed her hand in his. Not as a promise, not as an end to the pain, but as a beginning. The servants watched from the shadows, unsure what to make of it. The Duchess, who had once been mocked, ignored, pitied, now stood with quiet strength beside the man everyone feared. Not as his ornament, not as his prisoner, but as his equal. Their love wouldn't be like a fairy tale. It would be messy, cautious, built on the ashes of what came before. But it would be real. And for the first time, she no longer felt like she was living someone else's story. She was writing her own.